and welcome to all the truth seekers that have joined us today from around the world. I'm glad that you joined us today on this. I'm Mark McKelsey from GMDC, and we are having a few technical issues. I'm traveling and in Toronto today, so hopefully you can understand me. Doug Koontz from RNG, Planet Retail, who's hosting this session today, should be perfectly clear for you. For the next hour, I want to help you uncover ideas that will push you towards new thinking, both inside and outside your business. So as I'd mentioned, my name is Mark McKelsey from GMDC, and I lead the people and the projects that bring you education, trends, and next practices from Global Market Development Center. The Infocast today should inspire your to be profitable by demonstrating just how the curiosity and power of the consumer must be at the center of your strategy. In other words, the way you've done things in the past is not the way your future success will happen. Retailers and brands alike, more than ever before, must be adaptive and in constant flux in order to connect with your customers. How you respond to this session will determine your success. Without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm coming to you live from Toronto, as I mentioned, and Doug Koontz from Planet Retail is joining me. The title of this session is Merchandise Fundamentals and Life Cycles, the Transformation of the Physical Store. Today's Infocast should help you understand the value of insights, knowing how to look in the future, and most importantly, why chasing the now is not focusing on what's next will eventually create a barrier between you and the consumer. While the role of the store changes and the departments undergo dramatic transformations, the importance of executional excellence remains paramount. Having the right assortments, shelving, packaging, display, and pricing strategies will carry even more weight moving forward as stores curate more of their merchandise and the shift towards space moves into experiences. So during this session, we will examine best-in-class strategies and merchandise of execution in store. So with that said, welcome, Doug. Will you help our viewers know more about what they can learn today?
Sure, thank you, Mark. As Mark said, what we're going to be talking about is really how do we set and execute an in-store assortment strategy, and what are all the things that come along with that? So what does that mean for my inventory management capabilities? What does that mean for how I actually go about building an assortment and executing merchandising? And also, what impact does that have on the packaging I need to support all of those things? So I'm looking forward to being with you for the rest of the day.
Well, thanks, Doug. I'm looking forward to it as well. And might I add to our viewers that Maud scheduled to be part of this Infocast, and Doug, as a replacement, last minute, will be hosting this session. But either way, the insights are the same we're looking for. Before we get started and dive in, I'd like to remind you that we can take questions during or after the session. Simply use the Q&A button at the top of your screen, and we'll get to at the end of the hour. So let's get started. Back over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Mark. So as I share my screen here and kick off, I do again want to introduce myself really briefly. So my name is Doug Koontz, as Mark mentioned, with Planet Retail RNG. And if you're not familiar with Planet Retail RNG, we are a research and consulting company that focuses on digital retail. So how do I plan and how do I execute my retail business, whether I'm a retailer, a supplier, or anything in between, for a digital world? And as Mark said, in case it was a little choppy, you can please feel free to submit questions throughout this, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the conversation. We've left some time for Q&A. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And to remind you all, what does merchandise fundamentals really mean? You can think of it as, how do I use an assortment or merchandise in the physical store to create differentiation and drive traffic in a digital world? You can also think of it as, how do I just execute and plan an assortment strategy in this future landscape. But before we get there, if you've heard from Planet Retail RNG before, you might be a little bit familiar with this slide and this framework. because the world is moving so quickly and things are really evolving and it's really difficult to keep up with, we actually like to use this framework that we call STEEP. It's an acronym: Society, Technology, Economy, Industry, and Policy. But all it really means is there's a million things impacting our world and how we need to operate, how we need to go to market. But these 5 areas allow us to hone in on some of the really big things that are going to be impacting our future. And so what we try to do, and I'm going to skip over a bunch of this, but I think we'll spend a couple minutes just setting the context for the landscape that we operate in, is all of these drivers of change help us to make assumptions about the future of retail. Okay, what are the new demands of the future consumer? What is the what are the channels and kind of the competitive environment that we're going to be living in? How much money does my shopper have? What are the demographics of that shopper? What are the new technologies that might disrupt how they currently behave? And once we settle on all of those things, what it allows us to do is really paint a picture of the world that we're going to be living in and ultimately competing in the future. And so once we have a picture of that, then it allows us to work backwards and say, okay, what do I need to know? What do I need to be able to do? What do I need to decide right now or invest in right now so that I'm prepared for that future world? So for just a minute, I'm going to share our vision of that future, and then ultimately jump into how that affects this merchandise fundamentals that we've talked about. So when you add all of that up, what it gets to is what we've landed on is 4 really big themes, right? So one that we call Store of the Future. One, of course, e-commerce. It's impossible to talk about this digital world without talking about e-commerce. The supply chain, of course, and how it impacts both the store and online. And then the changing way that we need to engage and communicate with our shoppers as they have all of these new and emerging touch points, really brought on by technology and those changing shoppers. And so what we're going to focus on today is really that store of the future, and think of that as, how does the physical store need to change in a digital world? And ultimately, here's some of those things that are impacting our store. This is not going to be a surprise to most of you, but I just want to make sure that we level set for a second, because we're going to be talking about this throughout the rest of the time. So of course, the growth of e-commerce, we can't understate that. Just the act of volume moving online and what we call deleveraging physical stores has a huge impact on what we're talking about today. It also has a really big impact on the supply chain, on pricing, on inventory, a lot of these things that we're going to mention. Weakening demand for discretionary purchases. Think of that as income becomes more constrained. You've heard about this topic of the eroding middle class or pressure on the middle class. It means that lots of the stuff, if I can put it that way, that we used to buy, we might no longer have the income to buy, or it might also mean we don't value those things anymore, because that phone in our pocket can replace a lot of the physical goods that we used to buy. And this is a big theme, a broader shift from physical goods to experiences. And you can see consumer spending really around the world shifting away from physical things and towards experiences. And certainly that has a really big impact on not only what we put in our stores, but also how we go about merchandising and building an experience inside the store to try to capture as much of that spend as we can. And then the last really big impact, if you think back to those drivers impacting the store, is changing consumer expectations. So you have to mention the access to information, that phone in everyone's pocket, being able to look up price comparison, look up information about a product that you might be interested in, or even be standing in a physical store and buy it online. But it also is the changing behaviors and preferences. So you think about things like sustainability, Think about the importance of convenience to today's shopper who's always on the go. They're used to really personalized digital experiences that technology has enabled, and their expectations are that we replicate a lot of that inside of the store. And so ultimately, what are we left with when you think about all of these drivers impacting our stores? Well, obviously, some people are going to end up shutting down stores. And we've seen a couple of really notable examples of that. Toys R Us, most recently, just in the last week or so. You'll start to see people really try to tinker with their own models to try to adapt to some of these things. You'll see people try to just open smaller stores. These are all solutions, but ultimately retailers and kind of retailer leadership does not get paid to close down stores for the most part. And so what we're in the midst of is a big process where the entire retail industry is trying to understand, okay, what is the store of the future? What are the elements of the store of the future that allows us to use all of these really big physical assets we have all over the country and all over the world to continue to drive sales productively and profitably? Because there's no doubt that the growth of physical stores is slowing, and sales inside of those stores is also really quite under pressure. So when I say store of the future, what does that mean to us? There's 4 big elements that we tend to lean on when we try to describe the store of the future, right? Because first of all, we do not believe that stores are going to disappear in our lifetimes, right? It's not like everything is going to be done online in the next decade. But it does mean that we're going to need to adapt what we put in these stores and how we design stores with the impact of e-commerce and the changing consumer in mind. And so these 4 elements, we really think about experience, which I mentioned already. Give me a good reason to come into the store when I can go onto Amazon.com, get free delivery, and ship something to my house sometimes in 2 hours, definitely in 2 days, and it doesn't cost me anything extra, right? So that's not only education, services, events, all those sorts of things. Frictionless is really critical to this because I mentioned that importance of convenience and the options that e-commerce provides. Well, we need to, as physical retailers and suppliers inside of these stores, we need to be able to adapt to those expectations. Friction will turn people off of our stores because there's just too many options in the world. If we make it too hard, they're not going to come to us. Social is the third one. I think it's kind of minor compared to the others in the scheme of things, but how do we leverage these physical spaces as a way to reinforce kind of community and kind of physical interactions? And then really what we're talking about today more than anything else is curation as well. So not only how does my store design differ, but what do I put in that store? What types of merchandise? Where do I put this assortment? How do I structure the flow through the store? What does the aisle of the future look like? All of those things are kind of things we're going to be touching on today. And when we talk about curation, what we really mean by that is, it's no longer a one size fits all, right? It's much more targeted assortments and merchandise that are built for me or for you, or they have a very specific person in mind or a very certain specific type of shopper in mind. And ultimately, if we don't do that, we just become stores become a commoditized version of online where, yes, you can come touch and feel things, but how important is that for most purchases? Frankly, it's not that important. And so without some of these adaptations, we inevitably just wait for shoppers to transition to online because they realize that, oh, you know what, it doesn't cost me anything more. Sometimes it might be cheaper. It's really easy because it shows up at my door, or I can pick it up on my way home from work. And so these things are all really designed to combat the influences of that shift online. And look, the world doesn't have the perfect answer yet, right? So what you see here is from last year, just an aggregation of some of the top retailers in the world and all of the different things that they are testing. There's no silver bullet that anyone has discovered yet. People are testing anything from totally new store concepts and new banners to how do I just add a feature here or there or revamp a category to make iterative improvements as we go along. And grocery in particular, health and beauty, the kind of the mass hypermarket supercenter channels have been particularly active with a lot of these tests. And their goal is typically not to build something that they're going to suddenly be able to roll out across 3,000 Walmart stores, for example. What they're trying to do is identify ideas or concepts that are effective. They know not every test is going to work, but they're trying to find things that do work, and then figure out, how do I scale that across my store base? Or is this idea scalable across this store base so that I can continue to improve my stores in a digital world without just bulldozing the whole thing and rebuilding it from scratch? Because we know that CapEx is under pressure, that huge capital outlays on physical stores are not particularly realistic for most retailers right now, and probably won't ever be until they figure out how it plugs in more directly to the to e-commerce and that store of the future. So ultimately, where that leaves us is, I'm not going to talk about tons of store design and interesting fancy concepts, although there will be some cool best-in-class examples and case studies in here. What we're going to be talking about is really, how do I execute the fundamentals to deliver on that store of the future vision? Because when we know experience is important, when we know curation is critical, what does that mean for the day-to-day decisions I make? Just what I put on the shelves, how I showcase that on the shelf, where I point people to online. And really, we're going to talk about four themes, right? Inventory management, assortment, merchandising, and packaging. And while it's not probably the sexiest idea, I'd say inventory management is really critical here, because e-commerce is totally changing how we get products to consumers. So think about, for the last 30 or 40 years, what did we do? We had a manufacturer that put pallets and pallets of product onto a truck. They deliver truckload by truckload to a Walmart distribution center, let's say, and then from there, Walmart distributes it to its various stores. Well, that continues to be a component, and the biggest component of our route to market, right? From supplier or manufacturer, warehouse or factory, all the way to the end store and ultimately end shopper. But now, because of e-commerce, you have all these new ways to get products to people, right? So you think about, okay, I can deliver to a home. I can deliver to a home from a store. You think ship from store or ship from fulfillment center, right? So there's two variations there. I can go pick up a product in a store. I can drop it off at a pickup point and get it on my way home from work. I can put it in kind of a dedicated click and collect model, and that inventory is either fulfilled from a store or from a warehouse, right? You can quickly start to see how this complexity, or all these variations, create all sorts of challenges for both the retailer and their supplier partners to have their products in the right places at the right time. And so what inventory management is really going to be about over time is, how do I have things in the right place when I really need them? And we call that integrated real-time inventory management. What it means, think of it as kind of a connected network where you know where all of your inventory is, when it needs to be where, and how it can get there, right? It's kind of this web that crosses all of these different variations of the route to the end consumer. But the reality is that we're not really set up to do that yet. At least most retailers and most suppliers aren't set up to do that yet, because what we're trying to do is manage out of stocks. We know that out of stocks are a killer, particularly because if I can't get it at your store, I know I can go online and get it to my house in 2 days. So if I lose that transaction in the store, did I just push people online even faster than they might otherwise? But we also know that the inventory, it's really expensive to carry too much inventory. And as more volume moves online, we don't need the same amount of inventory in stores, but we do need, and we probably don't need more inventory than we have in the past because consumption's not really expanding, but we do need inventory kind of across this supply chain and replenishment network that it can get to the places that it needs to be in real time, if you will. So here's some research that was done in 2017, just asking retailers and suppliers what are their biggest challenges. And you can see for store-based retailers, okay, inventory accuracy, forecasting accuracy goals, even inventory visibility. I think step one is knowing where things are, and step two is being able to schedule and plan it appropriately so it's in the right places at the right times. You can see in the bottom left there what currently where we are as an industry. Here's think of it as, okay, can you currently do this? 24%, 37%, 27% across these things. Well, those are doubling, tripling, quadrupling over the next 3 years. So it gives you a sense for how seriously retailers can identify or are identifying this supply chain issue and inventory management issue as a challenge. Because ultimately, this is what it looks like. You've probably seen Walmart's initiative and focus around this space over the last year. About this time last year, they announced some new targets for their suppliers for on-time in-full delivery, and they've actually narrowed the window on that as well. And then in February, you can see they raised that expectation at 95%. I think they've actually revised that again a little bit since February. But think of the challenge that Walmart is trying to manage here. They know that they don't need as much inventory in their stores anymore because fewer people are entering those stores and more people are buying stuff online. But they have the same out of stock challenges. Maybe they don't offer the same exact assortment and amount of merchandise, but they definitely can't sit there with empty shelves. But they also don't want truckloads of merchandise sitting at the backs of stores or the backs of distribution centers, just accumulating cost. And so what they're pushing their retailers to do, or their suppliers, to do is to be delivering faster and more accurately so that think of it as constantly managing just a couple days of demand, right? When maybe in the back room, we might have had weeks of inventory in past years. Well, as productivity of these stores has declined, we can't afford to carry weeks of inventory across all of these categories anymore. So we're setting up the systems and the expectations that with only a couple days lead time, we're keeping up with demand. As something starts to get sold down, you're ready and able to replenish that, but not with necessarily a full truckload, but a much smaller amount of inventory. And I should mention, there are penalties that come with these things, right? Chargebacks on missing some of these targets. And Walmart's not the only retailer that's done this. Target announced something similar in 2017. And this will continue to become more common and more popular as we try to figure out how do we manage inventory in this digital world where we have to keep stuff on shelves, but we know that we've also got to be realistic about how much is moving through these stores, and also using e-commerce to complement that in-store physical assortment, which we'll get to talking about in just a minute. So here's the most extreme example of this. Perhaps you've all seen this, is Nordstrom expanding this inventory-free concept where you can walk in and you can buy things, but you actually can't walk out with that merchandise. They're going to deliver it to your home later on. And so the store ultimately becomes a showroom. Now, I know Nordstrom is a totally different animal than most of the grocers and a lot of the general merchandise players that we may interact with on a day-to-day basis. But what it does highlight is, one, that we're limiting the amount of touch points, or the touches required to get a product from the manufacturer's floor to the shopper's home. Because you think about how a lot of the buy in store, deliver to home concept. What are you doing? Well, typically you're shipping the merchandise to the store, and then they're taking that same merchandise and kind of following you home with it. Well, that's inefficient, obviously, and so retailers are trying to figure out a way, how do I limit the amount of kind of inventory transit, if you will, while also maintaining a shopping experience that justifies someone coming to the store. And I should say, obviously, most of the products bought at Nordstrom are not you're not going to go home and consume those in the next 20 minutes. You can't do this for a convenience store. You can't do this for a gallon of milk. But it does highlight how retailers are beginning to think about inventory in their stores, and ultimately where we're headed as an industry, where we're trying to minimize the amounts of inventory that sits across all of these physical stores, but also minimize out of stocks. And what ultimately that relies on is suppliers being much more flexible and agile with a view on real-time inventory, so that they can get it when they need to, where they need to, and it's less automated and scheduled, because it's more driven by shopper demand. So the second big theme is really about the assortment itself, right? And I've mentioned e-commerce and the volume moving online. Well, I should say this does not represent any specific store. It's kind of USA averages across categories, but you can. E-commerce categories are moving online at various differing rates, and so this is not going to impact every category in the exact same way at the exact same time. But what is definitely true is that our stores are slowly being emptied as volume moves online, and so we have to fill that space. What you see some retailers do is actually close stores, or even in some extreme cases become almost a realtor, where they divide the store in half, or take out 25% of the store and start renting that elsewhere, and just using what remains for the space that they actually need. But generally speaking, it's about how do we fill this space without it becoming unproductive. And our answer to that is really curation in many ways. So this is a bit of an oversimplification that you have in front of you, but it is true that some of the fastest growing retailers in the US have the fewest SKUs, right? So think about Trader Joe's, think about Aldi, Costco. They are simplified portfolios of products that are clearly targeted to a certain shopper base, and everything they do, all of the time and energy and investment, goes towards improving that proposition. We are still, as an industry, kind of caught trying to be all things to all people in some sense. And this is particularly true for a lot of the mainstream grocers, although to their credit, they've started to move away from some of these concepts where they're kind of all things to all people. What really effective retailers are doing is removing merchandise and assortments that don't help the bottom line and that don't help drive consumers into their stores, and they're doubling down on assortments that do. And so when we say curated, curated could be private label, right? Really targeted value proposition. Curated could also be local or organic or natural. Think about what a Whole Foods store looks like, with all sorts of local vendors of kind of premium drinks and artisan breads and kind of grocery granola bars, snack bars, all these things of these unique brands, where it's one of the only places other than online that you can actually get some of these things. And we won't get into all of Whole Foods' struggles here. That really drove a lot of Whole Foods' success for actually a couple decades. We think that curation starts to be targeted merchandise, and think of curation meaning we have these assortments, these products designed specifically for this targeted shopper base, and that's what some of these retailers do really well, and that's where other retailers are really struggling. As a supplier, what it means is that I'm probably going to have different assortments with different retailers or across different channels, because my whole portfolio is not going to be relevant across discount and department stores and supercenters and grocery and convenience. I know that it already hasn't been for a long time, but it's only going to get more extreme as these trends really bear out. And obviously, private label plays a big role in this too. So I mentioned that private label can be a part of curation. I saw a really interesting study recently where private label was added to the aisle. And we always think about private label as stealing shelf space from national brands, which is true and is a real concern. But in this study, the way they merchandised that store and that category in particular, it didn't really have a negative impact on national brands. What it did was lift the whole category, because they really smartly merchandised and assorted this store in a way that was kind of a really nice solution for their target customer. And I think ultimately how our categories or how brands interact together within a category becomes really important when we start to think about curation. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. But when you think about private label, we are close to the world average here, right, of top markets around the world and how private label penetration. We expect this will only get more severe because, one, value is important, cost is important to consumers, and so there's a really enticing proposition there. But two, the profitability is really important to retailers, and I think we know that private label does drive profitability, but that doesn't mean that national brands are going away. It just means that the relationship between these things is going to have to evolve, and we've seen really some of the most sophisticated brands in the world start to really work on how do they coexist with private label in the store. We don't think we're going to win the battle of just combating private label. It's going to get added to the shelf. So what's the assortment we need that sits next to that so that we can continue to grow our business inside of these stores? And so how will this assortment really change? I've talked broadly about these themes, but I think I talked about being all things to all people. You might think of that as mass market brands. The reality is there's not that many mass market brands in the true sense of the word, where there's kind of a singular product or SKU that succeeds across the entire landscape. There's a few exceptions, I'm sure. I guess Coke, Diet Coke, those might be a couple exceptions, but there's not a lot of brands out there that aren't moving in one of these directions, right? And so from a value proposition, we think of it in a couple different ways, both discount and what we call mass premium. So functionally, it has a pretty similar characteristics as a mass market brand, but there's some emotional value on top of that. The branding itself, I want to be careful here, but the branding itself has some sort of value there. So think of something like Nespresso compared to some of the more mass market coffee brands. And then of course, discount brands where price becomes the primary focus, right? And so you're going to have within these stores curated assortments that move in one of these two directions, typically, either towards the upper end or towards the more discount side of things. But then think of laterally how this stuff starts to move is we have innovation on these products themselves. And I know this isn't fundamentally different to something that we've been doing before, or kind of this is kind of category management and brand development 101 here, but these functional extensions, adding a point of difference to create a stronger connection with customers. So example here, something that increases convenience. Think of the cap or the top on some sort of liquid, right? That's really convenient or easy to get at, or going something from, think of in your local grocery store now, you probably have, okay, you can buy whole produce or you can buy it cut up for you, right? There's kind of a functional extension there. And then you also have target group extensions. So how do we build on existing successful products with new types of products or new characteristics? For example, a healthy living brand or a natural or organic or gluten-free version. These have proliferated around stores, but I think curation, instead of having everything in the portfolio, what you're going to see is just one of these pockets or just a couple of these pockets really be used in store assortments going forward for inside the retailers that are really focused on developing a targeted solution for a specific customer. And look, I know keeping up with the trends is really difficult. You see some really interesting examples out there from retailers where they are calling on their consumers, their own shoppers, to help them build new products. So this example is Target's Studio Connect program, where they're actually getting feedback on products and building that into the product development process. As well as the Tmall, Alibaba's major platform, this Tmall Innovation Center, actually uses the data consumption patterns on their platform and can partner with brands to help identify flavors, colors, variations that don't currently exist but might be really popular. Snickers created this really interesting, basically spicy candy bar using some of that data. And again, this is not going to be relevant to everyone in all circumstances, but I think what it emphasizes here is how important the product development cycle is going to be, because curating that assortment, creating a relevant assortment in stores is happening faster and more dynamically than ever before. And that creates all sorts of challenges for not only our production process, but all of the in-store merchandising and assortment work that we do every day with our retail partners. And look how quickly this can sort of unravel on us. This is an example of Hema Markets, again an Alibaba store, that they only keep 3,000 SKUs in their store, but 50,000 available that you can buy on the app while you're in the store, and then they promise to deliver it within 30 minutes, right? And so where they're locating their inventory and how they're choosing to go about the merchandising process and show you which assortments they're showing you versus which are actually really available for you to buy is that this really dynamic, evolving space. And ultimately how far this can go, they have this kind of home goods store called Home Times in China. There's only a couple of them right now, but every 10 to 15 days, the entire assortment is changed based on shopper behavior in the store and their user behavior online for all of their users around, I think it's a 10 or 15 mile radius of that physical store. So they're actually using the information that their shoppers are giving them, that their shopper habits and preferences and behaviors, to dramatically change what they put in the store every 2 weeks. Probably not realistic for all of us, but that's how sophisticated this can get. And I think we're going to start to see elements of that perhaps in a category here or there, or certain types of retailers here or there in the not too distant future here. And then, the third thing I want to mention is merchandising itself. So we know we can get products online. So what is the point of stacking up tons of merchandising in this kind of big wall of product where I can do the same thing online? What's the point of me coming to that store? What we're seeing is retailers revamp how they think about center store shelving and center store merchandising, from simply just displaying items to trying to generate excitement, generate an in-store experience, create an interesting experience out of that category. Because it gives me a good reason to come to that store. And candidly, it also is a really great way to grow your basket, because let's face it, if you're really excited in this store, you're really impressed, you're probably more likely to pick something up. And so here's a couple examples, one from Hershey's, one from Coca-Cola, where they are revamping or kind of re-envisioning aisles of really standard products, right? So the candy or confectionery aisle by Hershey's here, and you can see it's not exclusive to Hershey's. There are other brands in that aisle. I mentioned Curation and how private label coincides or plays with the national brands. What this did really effectively, it was an aisle designed with the shopper in mind and how they want to shop for candy, and it actually uplifted the full category, not just Hershey's. And then the other example here, Coca-Cola, this build your own six-pack idea, which kind of stolen from the beer industry, but again, another way to drive excitement and drive experience. It's something more than just, can I physically come to this store and leave with this product? It has more than a functional purpose, because this allows you to design your perfect pack. And in the process, maybe 6 cans isn't enough. You end up, in the past, let's say you bought a 6-pack of Diet Coke or a 6-pack of Sprite. Well, sure, you can mix and match and make a 6-pack of those two things, but perhaps instead you've also decided that you're able to try more flavors this way. So you can start to see how it expands trial and conversion, and also potentially expands your basket as well, because it gives you more opportunities to engage with these products. And then as I move on to our last fundamental, when we talk about kind of merchandise fundamentals, it really is packaging, and how does our packaging support this strategy? Well, the reality is we have less room for error in a world with fewer SKUs for a couple different reasons. One, we definitely have to maximize the people that are in the store, but we also need to differentiate ourselves in this store. Think about, you walk inside an Aldi or even a Dollar General to some extent, particularly some of these low-cost retailers. You're often looking at walls and walls of merchandise without a lot of investment or labor put to merchandising displays and other things like that. Well, the packaging itself has to stand out. It has to differentiate your product on the shelf. It maybe even has to communicate something that you may have done in a different way. And so the packaging itself becomes critical to kind of success in this physical store, in not only driving impulse, creating intervention points that maybe had to happen in a different way in the past. Obviously, sustainability plays a role here, but I don't want to get too much into product formulation, but that war on plastics is certainly a big theme. But then you know, you got to take a step back and ask, okay, how is our portfolio overall changing? Well, you think about all of those routes to market. We need to have e-commerce, digitally compliant packaging in mind when we're thinking about the products that we're building and creating and the packaging that we're using, because you know, what works in store, that's not the same needs you have to get something safely and securely to a consumer's door. And as I mentioned, with all of that complexity in the supply chain, it's typically not as simple as having one SKU with certain type of packaging for this route to market, one SKU with another type of packaging for this other type of route to market. It's a dynamic, fast-moving relationship that our inventory has across all of these different points and ways to the end consumer. And our products really need to be designed to be able to meet those needs. And so as we wrap up here, I'm going to pass it back to Mark in just a minute to field any questions that you have. I do encourage you all to use that Q&A function that you have here. But we're talking about how do we execute a assortment and merchandising and in-store strategy in this digital world. It all starts with, do we know where our inventory is? Do we have the technical capabilities and process and ways of working to get it to the places that it needs to be at the right time? Gone are the days of big back rooms where we can afford to put we can kind of dump lots of inventory on someone and not worry about it for a while. Retailers are only going to make this more extreme, and so how we manage our inventory is critical. And then what that in-store design, what that in-store purpose is evolving. And so we really need to think hard about our portfolio strategies. How do we curate merchandise and assortments that are targeted to a certain type of customer, that adds something that goes above and beyond what they can get online? And then ultimately, how do we have the merchandising and the packaging to support that? So as I hand it back to Mark here, this is a topic that we talk about quite a lot. If you have any questions, if you want to follow up with me, you can see both my contact information personally, as well as Planet Retail R&G's contact information, the best way to get in touch with us. We're also posting a lot of this stuff on our site and sharing a lot of this on LinkedIn as well. So if you want to connect with me, you'll probably get some more insights on these types of topics. But with that, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna hand it back to Mark and see what questions you all have for me.
Well, it's great. Thanks, Doug, again for hosting this session. We do have a few questions and top of the hour, so let's get straight to those. Doug, Katie is asking, do you think that part of the problem of the expansive assortment is the paradox of choice? It's just too much. Should we be offering fewer SKUs? Yeah,
so I'll relay, I think what I think you said there is the challenge of the paradox of choice are we overwhelming people with selection, and we have too many SKUs? Well, it's a complex question, of course. You know, online has this limited assortment. We talk about this endless aisle, but the reality about the endless aisle is, if you go on Amazon, it's 35% of people buy the first product listing and 70% of people buy off the first page. So sure, they've got millions and millions of SKUs, but people aren't discovering all of this naturally unless they're really diving in deep and looking for all of this assortment. So I think what it does tell us is if we put the right products in front of people, the range of assortment actually doesn't become quite as necessary. And so what you see people doing, what you see retailers and suppliers doing, is trying to hone in on what are the precise SKUs that we're going to need to meet the needs of this in-store shopper. And then if there's something else that they need, how do we kind of connect them to the rest of our assortment? So you see lots of, see more online, there's more options, more colors, more flavors, all those kinds of things online. And I think yes, we are, the paradox of choice is, I guess in some sense it's always been a challenge for retail. One of the reasons a retailer like Aldi is so successful is because you can get in and out of that store in like 15 minutes because it's so easy to shop through. They only give you 3 or 4 options, take it or leave it. If you don't like that, go to the other store, right? And so I do think retailers are going to push their supplier partners to move in that direction. It also becomes easier to manage some of the inventory challenges with limited number of SKUs because sure, maybe it fills up the same amount of shelf space, but we only have 5 variations instead of 15. And so some of that on-demand retail, real-time inventory demands become easier to manage for the entire supply chain.
Success with on-packaging QR codes.
I'm going to ask you to repeat that question one more time, Mark. You were a little choppy there.
Jim is asking, have you seen success? Jim is asking packaging QR codes.
So I think the question is success. Have we seen examples of success with QR codes on packaging? You know, you think about that Gartner hype curve of all of these technologies. QR codes is a big deal probably 6 or 7 years ago. And ultimately, one of the big barriers for it was it takes a long time to load. You got to take out your phone, you got to have an app, you got to scan it, then it's got to load, and who knows what the connectivity, Wi-Fi signal or whatever it is inside the store. And so people kind of went away from that. You know, I do think there's a role for QR codes because people are hungry for information. And it's one of the ways that suppliers themselves can control the information that they give access or that they provide to shoppers. Some of these really interesting, truly innovative store of the future concepts that maybe you all have seen in the past where we're talking very far out, not practical yet, but where you're picking up a product and a camera knows what you've picked up and screens above you, above the shelf are displaying information about that, where it came from, nutritional information, you name it. And so I think there's no doubt that information on products plays a really important role. But the way we seem to see people, suppliers in particular, attacking lots of these things is with these kind of touchscreen digital innovation concepts. Think about design your own fragrance in Sephora or something like that, right? Now I know that's kind of an extreme example, but we're seeing that's how people are driving information to customers, where they're kind of opting in that way and allows you to collect information. You know, the QR code has a role. The challenge is always adoption and do people actually use it? So there's a big conversation to have here about content strategy and shopper engagement strategies that support that. I could see that becoming more popular if there's kind of something that sits behind the QR code beyond these are the specs, these are the characteristics, where is there a social element in some way? Are you getting something out of scanning the QR code? Otherwise, I think what you're going to end up with is QR codes become important in a very early stage of discovery, maybe the first time you buy something, but then you're done, right? And I'd ask myself, is that really the most effective way to influence someone at the moment of truth when they're going through the selection process for the first time?
Well, thanks again for your time again today, Doug. And I think that concludes our session. We appreciate your time and the partnership that we have with Planet Retail.
Great, thank you, Mark.
If you'd like to come back and watch this session and all previous GMDC Connect Infocast, please go back to gmdcconnect.org and watch previous sessions or register for any upcoming sessions. Feel free to reach out to me at markm@gmdc.org, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. For joining us today.